Morning from Boston. Welcome to the Decolonization in Progress seminar. This is our last meeting of fall 2021, so a very warm welcome to the last meeting. We will see again in March, some of you. I'm your host and moderator. I'm Joyita Sarkar. I'm an assistant professor here at Boston University's Pardee School of Global Studies, and I am the director of the Global Decolonization Initiative that is hosting this event. Today, we are delighted to host this roundtable on decolonizing the study of Afghanistan. Many of us felt it was a necessary conversation to be had, both in light of the current situation, as well as in the context of the past, that how we have studied this country in the 20th century and how that knowledge has created tropes and limitations, often making it hard to situate Afghanistan that itself sits at the intersections of many cultures and many histories of Central Asia, Middle East, and South Asia. We are joined today on this roundtable by Dr. Wasma Osman from Temple University, Dr. Timothy Nunan from Free University Berlin, Dr. Annika Schmedding from Harvard University, and Dr. Elizabeth Leek from the University of Leeds. So I have given our four speakers the following prompt. What does decolonization of the study of Afghanistan mean to you and your scholarship? And how can we successfully go about it? So before I begin, I give the floor to Dr. Osman. Let me remind our attendees that this meeting is being recorded. So if you do not wish to be recorded, please mute your audio and video functions. Same applies during the Q&A when I'll be requesting you to raise your hand. If you don't wish to be recorded, send us your questions in chat to everyone. So one of us from the organizing side, that is me, or the roundtable side participants, one of them will get to you. Great. So let me begin by introducing our four panelists in the order in which they will speak. We will begin with Dr. Osman, who is an assistant professor at Temple University's Department of Media Studies and Production. She is a faculty affiliate of the Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, as well as the South Asia Center at University of Pennsylvania. She's also a filmmaker, and she is the author of this book published last year in 2020, which is called Television and the Afghan Culture Wars, brought to you by foreigners, warlords, and activists. After Dr. Osman, we will be joined by Dr. Nunan. Timothy Nunan is an assistant professor at the Center for Global History at the Free University of Berlin, where he leads a Volkswagen Foundation Freigeist research group devoted to the history of Islamism during the Cold War. And he is the author of Humanitarian Invasion, Global Development in Cold War Afghanistan, published by Cambridge University Press in 2016. After that, we will have our speaker in this order, that is Dr. Annika Schmedding, who is joining us from a different conference. So Dr. Schmedding, thank you for doing this. She is a cultural anthropologist and a current junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows, and her work explores belonging and community formation in post-conflict settings, as well as notions of representation and leadership among minority groups. And she obtained her PhD in anthropology from Boston University in 2020. Dr. Schmedding, welcome. Last but not the least, we will be joined by my colleague and friend, Dr. Elizabeth Leek, who is an associate professor of international history at the University of Leeds. Her first book, The Defined Border, The Afghan-Pakistan Borderlands in the Era of Decolonization, was published in 2016 by Cambridge University Press. And she has her second book that is forthcoming with Oxford, will be published in April next year, which is titled The Afghan Crucible, the Soviet Invasion and the Making of Modern Afghanistan. So with that, I extend a very warm welcome to all our roundtable participants and welcome to all our attendees. Dr. Osman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joyita, for hosting this important conversation. I think Afghanistan's been in the news so much, so it's very important these days to think about how knowledge is produced on Afghanistan, and discuss the discourses and its impact on policy as well. What I'm going to do today is highlight some of the key takeaways from my book, Television and the Afghan Culture Wars, in particular in regards to this question of decolonizing the study of Afghanistan. And I'll start by saying that what motivated me to write the book in the first place had to do in many ways with how knowledge is produced and how to decolonize that. And in particular, I would say that, misrepresentations of people from Afghanistan is ongoing, and that is very much steeped into the history of colonialism. And from Rudyard Kipling to Winston Churchill, what we find is tropes and imagery that portray people of Afghanistan as backwards and savages and stuck in time, oftentimes using those very words. And what that does is it creates a narrative that the people, A, don't really have a history, and B, are incapable of modernizing. And so with my book, I wanted to challenge some of these notions, because between my academic training and also, having grown up partially in Afghanistan, I consider myself Afghan American because I do remember the pre-war era of Afghanistan. And I know that there's a long history of social movements and movements for women's rights and activism around human rights and all kinds of other democratic institutional building. And so, so just to kind of give a little bit of background of how I got interested in this topic in the first place and why I wanted to focus on the media in Afghanistan. So in my book, Television and the Afghan Culture Wars, I demonstrate how the international community's interventions in Afghanistan have resulted in both imperialism as well as yielding positive development projects, including some problematic and misguided ones. The good development projects that I discuss in the book are participatory, they are collaborative, and they're grounds up. The misguided ones, including some women's rights projects and opium crisis management, tend to be top-down and heavy-handed or naive, often blaming individuals instead of larger structures of war, corruption, and poverty. SIGAR, which is the Office of the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, was mandated in 2008 by the US Congress to provide oversight of US reconstruction expenditures. They have exposed numerous cases of fraud and misappropriation of monies. In the media sector, where I focused most of my ethnographic research on prior to the Taliban takeover, Afghanistan experienced a surge in new media institutions, which produced a robust and vibrant public sphere. Hundreds of free broadcast television and radio stations, a fledgling internet infrastructure, and mobile telephone companies were set up. Most of the funding for the rapid proliferation came from the international donor community. And the international donor community included many nations that had agreed in the Bonn conferences, or what's called the Bonn agreements, to support Afghanistan's nation building. Having poured millions of dollars into media in the Middle East, the US was one of the largest donors. Certainly the US wanted to generate content and ideology through the media that favored them. However, local producers, I found, were mostly able to assert their own creative and political agendas. This is not to say that there are not egregious cases of media censorship and imperialism. There are, or were, most US-funded Afghan television stations were incentivized to portray the US war in Afghanistan in a favorable light. However, I also make the point that it's important to distinguish between the malevolent in the better development projects, because it's in these spaces and gaps that the agency and freedom to deviate from the prescribed script and message can manifest and thrive. So another concept that I introduce, or these two concepts that I introduce in my book, are the imperial gaze and the development gaze. And I do so in order to understand the complexities of the merger between development and imperialism. Indeed, as many scholars have shown, there are two sides of the same coin, with one bringing in the other. And the other problem, of course, is that imperialist agendas oftentimes undermine the altruism and the genuine intentions to, improve situations with development projects. But as I said before, I reiterate the point that it is important to differentiate between the two, because I did analyze and study and interview people who were working with development and nation building projects that did have positive results. The danger with the imperial gaze is also that it has merged the scientific method with governance. This coupling renders weaker countries like Afghanistan as a blank canvas devoid of any history or culture, thus giving godlike power to technocrats who, with a wave of their wand, can and have entirely remade, transformed, and slashed and burned countries. According to Achille Membe, destroying the infrastructure is a key component of rebuilding, as is building parallel but different structures for the elite and the rest of the population. Today, the US wields incredible power over all facets of Afghan life, including death, culture, and geopolitics. And I would argue this is still the case even after the withdrawal. However, Afghanistan's asymmetrical positionality is not simply one of unilateral subjugation. Rather, Afghans see themselves as neither victims or free agents, but as negotiators, diplomats, and hagglers who have always had to make tough compromises in order to maintain a very shaky sovereignty. This is true of the media makers I interviewed as well, who found themselves in this in-between position. Now, the last thing I wanted to highlight, because I want to make sure I leave plenty of time to speak with my esteemed co-panelists, many of whom I know and have been on other panels with, and looking forward to audience discussion as well. But so the last point I wanted to bring up is what I call the problem of metrics of measurement, and how the US, similar to the USSR, previously during the Cold War, used women's rights and education as a justification for their various interventions and so forth. And the problem really arises from the fact that most of the studies conducted and most of the measurements and metrics and statistics are produced within colonial state bodies and institutions, and are not only produced, but oftentimes funded by those same institutions. And so we have to ask the question of the accuracy of those measurements, in particular in regards to human rights, women's rights, and education, which are some of the key trifecta that colonial powers or imperial powers have used in justifying their interventions in the past. And I'll point out a few historical data sets from the PDPA, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, which was the communist government of Afghanistan during the Soviet occupation and prior to that point as well, and then compared with some statistics that have come out during the more recent last 2 decades long war on terror, or the US war in Afghanistan. So the PDPA's rhetoric regarding women's rights, education, and class disparities was very progressive, And the statistics that the party published showing the success of its programs in empowering women, the poor, and ethnic minorities were also quite impressive. Yet upon closer inspection of the PDPA's policies, many of its projects fell short. The Khalq Party instituted an ambitious literacy program. According to Nancy Dupree, quote, by September, the remarkable and improbable figure of 926,000 men and women were enrolled in literacy courses, end quote. For the Khalqis to initiate a large-scale literacy project with incredible results of almost 1 million students enrolled in a matter of a few months was unrealistic, a point that she makes in her article. And the Afghan scholar Parveen Ali Majru concurs that the PDPA's statistics on its own education and literacy programs were highly suspect. And she does so in one of her articles called Afghan Women Between Marxism and Islamic Fundamentalism. Majru illuminates how the communist coup of 1978 was in fact damaging to the progress achieved in prior decades. Once again, SIGAR, the Office of the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, has also exposed numerous, and this is an office that is a U.S. Congress mandated office, but it has effectively exposed numerous cases of fraud and misappropriation of American taxpayer monies. Some of SIGAR's investigations in the last 2 decades of the U.S. Interventions in Afghanistan have included findings of fraud with the Kabul Bank International Monetary Fund scandal that shut down the bank, and USAID's $216 million project called Promoting Gender Equity in National Priority Programs. The Afghanistan papers, which were a set of 2,000 pages of internal documents from SIGAR obtained by the Washington Post through the FOA, or the Freedom of Information Act, further confirms that fraud and corruption was prevalent in some of the US development projects. In a testimony before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, John Supko, the Special Inspector General himself, said that more than 132 billion of US money spent on development in Afghanistan was marked and marred by, quote, mendacity and hubris. Another quote from the Washington Post Afghanistan papers is, quote, as an example, Supko said US officials have lied in the past about the number of Afghan children enrolled in schools, a key marker of progress touted by the Obama administration, even though they knew that the data was bad. He also said US officials falsely claimed major gains in Afghan life expectancy that were statistically impossible to achieve, end quote. And when these large-scale cases of fraud and corruption are revealed and become public, international donors and their Afghan partners are often quick to point fingers and lay the culpability on each other. But what I wanted to highlight here was A, the problem of statistics and where the funding comes from, and B, to draw parallels, because as we know, Afghanistan has been at the center of imperial ambitions for centuries now. And so between the Cold War and now we have the war on terror / US war in Afghanistan, some of the same types of rhetoric was used, and the same type of what are called cooking the books, statistically exaggerating these types of numbers happened in order to make the situation sound better than it was when it comes to these types of metrics of progress. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to opening it up for conversation and hearing from my co-panelists. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Osman. We will now hear from Dr. Timothy Noonan. Tim, the floor is yours.
Excellent. First off, thank you to Jay for organizing this panel, and thanks to my esteemed co-panelists for joining us in obviously a very difficult and troubling time for the future of Afghanistan. So as Professor Sarkar indicated, the prompt provided to us was what it would mean for us to decolonize the study of Afghanistan. And I'd like to offer kind of a quick series of reflections on what this would mean to me, organized around a couple of thematic areas. But first, I think it's just important to state, at least for me personally, why this matters and why I think this is an important conversation to have. Right now, as Afghanistan is heading into a potentially brutal and catastrophic winter, I think in the American mind and in American media, it is really at the risk of being tossed into a memory hole and kind of forgotten post August 2021, which raises these questions that Fajma highlighted in her opening remarks. So I think it's really, really critical for us to think about the way that the media is framing things and the ways in which Afghanistan kind of appears in the headlines as an object of geopolitical intrigue, but disappears at other times, even when its population is at the risk of famine. For me, more personally, though, I think one reason why it's important for me to have this conversation is in my own studies and in my own work, I feel like I've learned so much from Afghan intellectuals. Oftentimes in writing on Afghanistan, I think there's a strong tendency on the Great Game or the Cold War or geopolitical competition. And Afghanistan is an object of regional geopolitics. There's a reason why these frameworks are so popular for looking at the history of the country. But in my own reading, especially through Persian sources, I've learned so much from Afghan intellectuals who have reflected on their country's own predicament. And beyond just these themes of geopolitics and kind of high politics, I've learned so much about art, about poetry, literature, and so on. And I think when we talk about, at least for me, when I talk about decolonizing the field, I think it's important to highlight this geopolitical piece, but also to remember that Afghans are people who make music, who make poetry, who make different forms of art, and kind of capturing that human face as well. So just having said those personal remarks at first, I'll try to kind of plant the flag across 4 areas that can maybe set up our conversation in a little under 10 minutes or so. And these thematic areas will be knowledge, the international, sources, and what I call thinking in the world. So what would it mean to decolonize the study of Afghanistan across these 4 areas? Well, if we talk about knowledge, I think that Fajma has already hit on this point quite extensively. If we talk about decolonizing what it means to study Afghanistan from the point of view of knowledge, we might be talking about the structure of the field. Is there such a thing as Afghanistan studies? Where are its institutional homes? What is the relationship of Afghanistan studies to Middle Eastern studies or South Asian studies? How are Afghans or Afghan diaspora scholars being integrated into the discipline, and so on? How have American and historically Russian and British engagements of the Pashto language, of interpreters, and so on, militarized certain areas of expertise around Afghanistan? And so this is obviously, I think, one thematic area that we need to discuss. In my own work, I focused much on how Soviet area studies traditions have affected the way that Afghanistan is studied. And for me, I originally came to the study of Afghanistan, perhaps less so through the lens of British India or through the subcontinent, and more through the history of the Soviet Union and Central Asia. And I think one potential moment of hope or potential direction we can talk about is examining the history of Afghanistan, not just through this traditional sort of South Asia optic, but through multiple different geographic access points, whether through Central Asia, whether in terms of linkages with Iran. In my own work, my own current work, I look a lot at how Afghans thought about decolonization through places such as Vietnam or Lebanon or Eritrea, through Palestine, and so on. So I think reflecting on the way that area studies has historically marginalized and, as Wajma said, misrepresented Afghanistan, but at the same time thinking about how alternative area studies frameworks or indeed trans-regional area frameworks might offer new knowledge. And here I'm thinking of the work of people like Nivi Manchanda, Shah Mahmood Hanifi, Martin Bailey, and Ben Hopkins have all kind of gestured in this direction with their work. What do it mean to decolonize Afghan history in terms of the international? Well, here I think there's a lot of work out there, among others, Elizabeth's, well, both of her books now, I think. And here I think we have a question as scholars of how we write Afghanistan into larger histories of decolonization. We're having this conversation within a initiative at BU for the study of decolonization. And yet I think if you ask most people or most scholars when and how or where decolonization happened, I think most answers would probably center around the continent of Africa or the late 1950s and the early 1960s. And I think a big challenge that we face as scholars of Afghanistan is situating the country's political independence in 1919 into these larger histories of decolonization. What or how exactly, or did Afghanistan become independent in 1919? What did it mean to obtain political sovereignty at that moment? How have Afghans and Afghan states related to international organizations, whether the League of Nations, the United Nations, and so on? How has the question of Pashtun self-determination in both Pakistan as well as Afghanistan been filtered through these international organizations? And how did Afghans looking at the self-determination struggles of other nations affect the question of Pashtun or Baluch self-determination, and conversely questions of federalism and multi-ethnicity within Afghanistan itself? And then finally, thinking about, say, socialist groups or Islamist groups. One theme that appears a lot in my research now is that even, say, Islamist groups who identified very strongly with the Islamic Revolution in Iran did not reject the United Nations or did not necessarily reject the non-aligned movement as frameworks for a future Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Rather, they felt that the international community had abandoned them, had not taken their plight seriously following the Soviet invasion. They pointed to events such as the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, or the Iraqi invasion of Iran, saying, look, this all shows how these international organizations are a joke. There is no kind of liberal international order for us to join anyway. And so it's our task to reform this. So this question, I think, of how Afghans have thought about international community and how historians both of Afghanistan or of the UN and decolonization write the history of countries like Afghanistan or perhaps Iraq or Ethiopia into these larger histories of decolonization centered on the 60s and 70s is a big question. Thirdly, decolonization in terms of the problem of archives and sources. This is a special problem, I think, that historians in particular face, but obviously our anthropologist colleagues have their own challenges here as well. If we say that Afghanistan or Afghan history has been colonized in some sense, this perhaps implies that there's a colonial archive. But as we know, if you want to write the history of colonial British India, you can go to London and maybe Calcutta and New Delhi and sort of find the archives for this. If we want to write the history of Tanzania or Egypt, similar processes apply. And I think if we want to write the history of Afghanistan, we face immediate questions as to what the archive is and where it is, and for what part of Afghanistan and what kind of asset or resource in Afghanistan. In the course of my own research on a history of development in Afghanistan, writing the history of state farms in Jalalabad in eastern Afghanistan could take you to the former Soviet Union, to Soviet archives of state committees for agricultural development, engaging sources in Russian there. If you want to write the history of forests and rivers in Paktia in eastern Afghanistan, well, then the archival path may take you to Germany. It might take you to archives in Switzerland. You might be engaged in the archives of development experts there as well. Want to write the history of water and dams in Afghanistan? That might take you to the United States. The history of animals in Afghanistan, the history of the Kabul Zoo, might also take you to Germany. So I think here we face complex problems about sort of where the archives are. Can Afghans access them, even if we aspire to a more representative or more open field? And while there's many initiatives out there, such as the Afghan Data Project run by the Afghanistan Center at Kabul University, I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of room for improvement in terms of digitizing more sources, making them machine readable, and establishing really sustainable initiatives for students, but also for Afghan scholars and non-Afghan scholars to engage them and put them in conversation with other sources from around the world. So finally, a category that I would call maybe awkwardly thinking in the world. And this is something that is really interesting to me right now in my own research. namely how Afghans have historically made comparisons, analogies, and metaphors to their own situation with the situation of the decolonizing world. How Afghans looked at anti-colonial struggles in locations such as Africa, Vietnam, or elsewhere to formulate their own political project. How Afghans looked at outside powers, whether India or China or the Soviet Union, as models for Afghanistan on the global stage. And here I just highlight two examples that I think show how much room there is for people to do, or how much work there is for people to do to render the voices of Afghans legible and sort of think through how Afghans have thought kind of with decolonization. One example is from an outstanding and really freely available book by the young Afghan historian and kind of bibliophile, I guess you could say, Atiq Arvand, who put together recently a wonderful Persian language book called Ya Socialism, Ya Tawahush, or either socialism or barbarism. It's a really useful and splendidly edited collected volume of most of the most important newspaper articles from various generations of Afghan leftist intellectuals throughout the 20th century. And in preparation for this panel, I was just looking through the volume and came across an interesting example, or an interesting article from the newspaper Parcham in the 1960s by Mir Akbar Khyber. Mir Akbar Khyber is probably famous to most historians of Afghanistan for being killed and sort of inadvertently triggering the April Revolution, or the so-called April Revolution in 1978, but he was also an intellectual and writer and author before his murder under mysterious circumstances. And it's interesting looking at some of these articles, how Khyber was talking about neocolonialism. He was very critical about World Bank aid programs to Afghanistan in the 1960s, and was pointing out how, maybe the Soviet Union can offer us a better deal in terms of modernizing a so-called backwards country. So, looking through these sources, which again are freely available and have been, curated through the exquisite and painstaking work of Afghan intellectuals like Arvand, I think there's a lot of room out there for connecting the intellectual history of Afghanistan with the history of international institutions. A second example, and then I'll wrap up briefly. Another figure who I'm really fascinated by in my current work is the Shia Hazara cleric and poet Ismail Balkhi. Balkhi was a cleric who kind of fled the Hazara struggle for greater national confidence, you might say, and greater self-determination. And he was imprisoned for the better part of, I think, 14 years during the 1950s and early 1960s after unsuccessfully attempting to lead a coup d'etat against the royal family. And Balkhi brings us to the question of sources. He's a really important figure for the Hazara, but most of his intellectual output is poetry, a source that I think it's fair to say historians aren't always comfortable or experienced, at least speaking for myself, in terms of engaging. But figures like Balkhi, I think, were really thinking globally. They were thinking about changes in the world around them and weren't just thinking about the provincial, the minority, the Hazara as a kind of national problem. And just maybe to close, I'll just read a few lines from one of his poems, Tonight, written in prison. He says, "The century is famed and illuminated. It is the age of the atom. The precincts of the universe have become illuminated for man tonight. From east to west, to the shacks and around the world, science and technology are the shining candle tonight. The ship has left to the sky, the airplane from the ocean. The load on animals' shoulders has become light tonight. London, Moscow, Washington, Berlin, and Beijing, like a family that has been separated and is looking for one another tonight. The continent has become full of jewels, and in the Sahara, a bouquet of roses has grown where camel thorns once stood tonight. In Europe and America, and in China and Japan, the peasant owns an electric stove tonight. All the people of the countries are content, yet again competing and vying for primacy tonight. Everyone is free and possesses various blessings, and yet a backward nation is frightened tonight." So there's much that I think one can say about Balkhi's poetry, and again, this is a man who published tens of thousands of lines of poetry, so there's really not a problem of documentation. But already here in this poem written in the early 1960s, we see somebody thinking about Afghanistan as a so-called backward nation suffering under an autocracy, and looking to these problems of development. How our people can get these electric stoves? How can we coexist and live in a world in which there are superpowers out there that are much bigger than our own country? How can we develop and have these sort of bouquets of roses in our own deserts, much like African countries have begun to develop at this time as well? So the broader point is, I think, whether you're interested in the history of socialism and figures like Mir Akbar Khyber, the history of the Hazara, the history of kind of proto-Islamism in the case of Balkhi, I think viewed through the lens of decolonization and thinking with the world or thinking in the world, there are a lot of really, I think, interesting and I think empathetic and kind of human opportunities for connection here. So in closing, I think it's a really difficult moment right now. You know, I'm not entirely sure always how sort of more history can help, but I hope that these impulses have maybe given us some idea. And I just want to say finally that if anybody out there is listening and sort of looking for potential host opportunities at universities in Germany, I'm very open to working with Afghan scholars on this, and they can follow up with me afterwards. But thank you for listening, and I look forward to Annika's comments.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Nina and Dr. Schmedding.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope, as Jay already mentioned, I'm at another conference. I'm in a hotel room. I hope that my internet holds steady, and I hope you can hear me well. So yeah, thank you for inviting me to speak today, and thank you to the Global Decolonization Initiative at Boston University and Jay for organizing this panel discussion, as well to my distinguished co-panelists actually for such wonderful input already that you have provided. And the three aspects that I would like to address in my allotted time, there are ways of taking stock, I think, of the current situation, as well as what we may be lacking or what could or should maybe develop in the study of Afghanistan. And I categorize them under three different points. One of them is the structure of Afghanistan studies, which also then addresses who's actually in the room, who speaks, and how is this facilitated by the current field of Afghanistan study. And a second, on which some of my co-panelists have already touched, are questions of like themes and terminology that we use and what is being spoken about and with which terminology. And then the third that I want to add to it is questions of solidarity and our own position within these structures in this system. And I think if we look around in this virtual room, we see several structural aspects of what most of us might have experienced in the past decades as Afghanistan studies. And I'm saying this, by the way, with the highest respect for my esteemed panelists and their scholarship as well. So we were all educated in non-Afghan institutions in the West, no matter whether we are Afghan, have Afghan heritage, or are non-Afghans. So we all situate our work in crucial respects towards Western discourses on Afghanistan. And we might fight or deconstruct them, but we are still embedded within them. And we're from different disciplines with 2 historians and 2 anthropologists. And while this already shows an interdisciplinary spread, there are of course many different disciplines that contribute to the study of Afghanistan, from political science, economy, legal perspectives, psychology, media and literary studies. So Afghanistan studies is actually really diverse and is not located within one particular discipline. And that's an aspect that I actually find to be a strength of Afghanistan studies, because it has a diversity in approaches. But it also leads me to another point of what Afghanistan studies is, and it is not anchored in particular departments. And that's a crucial aspect when thinking about exchange within the field of study, but also structurally where different researchers are located and how building solidarity and support is enabled or hindered by the structure or the lack thereof. So Afghanistan studies has historically found it difficult to locate itself even in particular area studies departments, as we already talked about, because it could be positioned, of course, in Central Asian studies, but it is also sometimes counted as belonging to South Asian or Middle Eastern studies because it shares these cross-cutting issues in certain aspects with each of these areas. And I think that's also the reason why we find scholars who work on Afghanistan not anchored within one particular regional conference, for example. The American Institute of Afghanistan Studies, for example, has alternated between having its membership meetings either at the Central Eurasian Studies Society or at MESA. And Afghanistan Studies still doesn't directly know where it belongs, in my view at least. And maybe that's a strength because of the ability to selectively situate itself and to draw on different discourses and positioning. But it also brings up these questions in terms of concerted efforts to rethink the field and to structurally change it. In which venues do we actually come together to rethink our field, for example? And there's, of course, some promising institutions that did exist within Afghanistan or still do exist. I mean, right now, the situation is fluid and we got to see like how institutes are going to be situated. But there's, of course, the Afghanistan Center at Kabul University, ACKU, or ARU, for example, the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit, which have fostered research within the country and which convened also conferences as well. And while these institutes were kind of to a stronger or lesser extent also linked to, you know, development questions and to policymaking, they were still a part of building up and interrogating the structures who researches on Afghanistan. And when I talk about structure, what I mean is kind of the informal network structure that Afghanistan studies inhabits in a way. Even on this panel, we are from different cities, countries, and institutions, brought together by the power of Zoom. But this also poses certain difficulties. It can potentially make it harder for structural change to occur within hiring practices, whom to lobby for to hire more scholars from Afghanistan, which universities to demonstrate our petition against, which department if we're situated in different disciplines. So as researchers who work on Afghanistan from a myriad of different vantage points, we need other structures of solidarity, I find, and support also for Afghan colleagues that can support them in their research and career pursuits and publishing. And it's a question that how can we reconfigure the field so that Afghan voices are not added as interlocutors and victims that illustrate case studies, but as colleagues with a critical voice. And this goes both for general career trajectories as well as panels such as this. And I think anthropology is also an interesting discipline to think through that in a sense, because there has been no large-scale teaching of anthropology within Afghan higher education, really. There were individual courses that were available for students, but no structures through which they could pursue PhDs or a career in anthropology within Afghanistan prior to the takeover of the Taliban. So higher education was structured in a way that it befits expectations of the occupying forces and then government supported by Western NATO countries. And I found, for example, the focus of many private universities in Afghanistan's urban centers pretty telling for that, with a focus on economics, political science, English language, and computer skills. So the foci of research must also be read within the context of Western intervention and occupation and the neoliberal university structuring geared towards producing students in particular fields of study. And social science research were secondary in that. So most Afghan anthropologists were educated abroad in the West. Big names definitely of like who worked in the 60s and 70s were, and even the ones who are currently working in Afghanistan. And while right now, of course, higher education in Afghanistan and the Taliban is in question overall, I think we do need to ask ourselves where and how we want to see change happening in the future in these structural terms. And I think, of course, all of this can be seen as a weakness, the current state of the field, as well as the lacking structural support for Afghan scholars and Afghan scholars from institutions within Afghanistan. But it can also be seen as taking stock and seeing it as a place of departure. Where do we want to go from here? If we want to have a diversity of voices, then we need actively to create those spaces, those alliances and collaborations, and to make space for these voices and to elevate them in the ways that they find beneficial. And of course, it's not going to get solved in one of those discussions, but through, of course, systematically taking stock and pushing for change in hiring practices, stepping back from commitments when Afghans are not in the room, actively building up networks of solidarity, co-publishing, working together. But as other co-panelists have already pointed out, it is not only about who is in the room, but also what is being spoken about and how. And here I want to draw on two short examples, also from my own research. So one of the questions that I find always instructive is to ask ourselves what our blind spots are, what is being talked about and what is not. And one example, of course, is our categories. So why, for example, are there so many studies on ethnicity in Afghanistan? Well, ethnicity, of course, is a salient category of social analysis and one that is also important and interesting to investigate in Afghanistan's context. It is not the only one. And I would argue that studies on crucial aspects of Afghan society are missing because we stay within particular confines of knowledge production that have had salience in how that knowledge could be used also potentially to control and govern. And as Nivi Manchanda has shown in her study on history and politics of imperial knowledge, there is a knowledge industry concerning Afghanistan, which has portrayed it as a tribally organized society. And commentators found importance in understanding both tribes and ethnic makeup of the country and to map it, not least to also govern it. So while there are these certain terms, both in the construction and deconstruction of the use and usefulness, there are other terms that are virtually absent from our vocabulary on Afghanistan. And for me, one of those examples is class. Why do we not have analysis of varying classes and class structures or socioeconomic dynamics within Afghanistan? A lot of literature talks about class implicitly, like about the urban poor in IDP camps or the excesses of the political elite, but it's devoid of theorizing it, which is, by the way, a general problem within the field of Afghanistan studies. Its general lack of contributing to larger frames of theory production, at least in some fields. And this also has to do with where the literature is usually anchored. Most of that literature that focuses on poverty and working class comes from neoliberal humanitarian work and is embedded within the drive to develop Afghanistan with a particular uncritical approach to modernization. So I've yet to see more critical work on the middle and upper middle class habitus that was created by the occupation, for example, with the valorization of English as a language of communication, with the Fulbright scholars creating their own groups and class of people who also fed into the last Ghani government upon return to Afghanistan. And I feel that class formation is crucial. It's a cross-cutting issue and we know fairly little yet about it, with exception of some interesting forays. One of the first scholars in whose work I've also seen class even appear in scholarship in Afghanistan was actually distinguished co-panelist Wajma Osman's book. And also Jennifer Motashashvili has offered a great example in a study of private property and land rights in Afghanistan, who talks out more implicitly about it. And what I'm not arguing that class is the only or even the most important category, but what I'm calling for is a critical distance towards our own terminology, the categories we use to think, write, and explain, and the ways how this thinking is limited or led to or away actually from certain categories. So of course, decolonization has to start with our minds, with the categories we use that color the way we see the world. And another aspect, of course, is the cross-pollination of different categories of life and the data it yields. So I actually think that there's already exciting research being done in that field. So for example, I keep thinking in this regard, for example, of Meshkan Masumi's fabulous research on Afghan radio, which uses songs and music to tell Afghanistan's history from a different vantage point that takes into account a different sensorium. And I also think of James Cairns' work on orality and Pashtun poetry and cultural production that explores how these poets comment upon war and ecological degradation. But how to get away from the primacy of texts to include other modes of knowing, sensing, and experiencing. And I believe that access points to use music to talk about history, to analyze dreams within Islamic frames, to discuss community formation or political positioning, or to attend to the various ways that poetry pervades everyday life. Those are starting points to open up to kind of a plurality of sources. But they can also perhaps open up to how we present our data and make it accessible. These different access points can potentially provincialize the primacy of nation-state framings and show important transnational linkages, as for example, Meshkan's work does. And another blind spot in the anthropology of Afghanistan, I actually believe, have been religious actors. And I will take here an example from my own research on Sufi communities in Afghanistan that I conducted during my PhD research time. So a whole strain of Afghanistan studies writing has engaged with the critique of the intense politicization of the so-called women's question in Afghanistan, of the liberation rhetoric of saving Afghan women, that of course undergirded the whole military intervention and the problematic expression it has had with the rights discourses that fused it with universal human rights and this Western style modernity and women's empowerment rhetoric. It's an environment in which Afghan women are either categorized as like the oppressed other, lacking any kind of agency, or as a singular success story, possessing kind of like a heroic form of agency. And underpinning this development rhetoric and its translation into practice is the assumption that also somehow presumes Islamic and traditional practices as limiting women's subjective agency. Women are represented as rather homogeneous group with similar aspirations facing comparable challenges. a calculation in which Islam is treated as a simple tool that is either mobilized to constrain women and their agency, or used to legitimize also particular actions. I mean, we've seen also in development discourses that have started using Islam as a way of like talking for particular women's rights. But women are rarely considered as Muslim actors who contribute to shaping or formulating Islamic practices and discourses. So researchers has of course engaged more critically with gender as a dimension of political and social life in Afghanistan, and attempted to capture the manifold aspects of Afghan women's lives by locating them within their social networks, their gender bending practices, and in conjunction with oral histories that have offered counter narratives. But in most writing on women in Afghanistan, Islam and Islamic cultural traditions are either perceived as a backdrop to the lives of the actors, sometimes kind of unobtrusive, and at other times more patriarchally oppressive, rather than an active dimension of social life that women could also creatively engage with or lead. And I argue that the portrayal of Islamic injunctions and a religiously sanctioned patriarchal system that women either need to endure or fight against encapsulates two aspects of erasure. It narrows Islam to a definition of orthodoxy or tradition that excludes different variants, and it silences women as religious actors in their own right. So by contrast, in some of my research, one of the Sufi communities that I worked with, a Qadiriya Sufi order, women were teaching weekly classes alongside leading zikr circles for women. They were actively teaching a new generation of women to lead religious practices. And for them, Islam was a lived reality that they shaped and shared with each other. Belonging to a growing Dari and Pashto speaking mixed community, university educated, middle class, it is also these women, together with most Sufi communities, that have not found any attention in contemporaneous writing in Afghanistan studies, which point to the many fields of study that not only yield interesting perspectives, but also opportunities to revise our understanding of Afghanistan. And so I want to conclude with just another one or two few points. So I talked about the structures that currently exist and about critically evaluating topics and themes. And I think part of the discussion should also be about our own position in knowledge production. On the one hand, if I am of course thinking about the well-known anthropological approach to reflexivity within field work, how are we individually positioned in our abilities and constraints to interact? How does who we are and how we are being read change our interaction with anyone we meet and interact with? And this goes, of course, for the multiple aspects of privilege, ranging from gender, being what I call a passport elite, or being white or from the region or Afghan. And we should support more a privileged cognizant attitude instead of a privileged evasive positioning. That means placing ourselves into our text and the encounters and dynamics that we describe. Especially white and Western scholars should take responsibility for each other and reminding each other of how differently situated researchers are. And we, and I'm speaking here, of course, as a white European researchers, should work not only to critically examine our own position, but also to work towards developing the field to become more access equitable for researchers from multiple locations, be that socially or geographically. And another question, of course, in terms of solidarity and knowledge production for me is the question of whom do we produce knowledge for? If we actually believe in the pursuit of knowledge other than our own careers, how do we share these insights and whom do they discuss them with? So I discussed articles that I worked on with the community members that I worked in, and I amended my research in consultation with them. I've discussed findings and ways of thinking with them, but I think our research practice, of course, need to go much further. And with this, I'm inspired by colleagues of mine, such as Javanshir Azir, but also other regional scholars, such as Zara Ali. In a recent panel that I shared with Javanshir, he was pointing out the need to unlink knowledge production from state narratives. And I believe that many historians, of course, are already doing this crucial work, but for him, it's also led to a close collaboration with people in Rohr to write their own accounts of their community history. And we should also think about translating our work into local languages, such as Dari and Pashto, as colleagues such as Reza Husseini and Lisa Schuster have done at the Afghanistan Center at Kabul University. But we could also work collaboratively on syllabi and courses on Afghanistan, like Zara Ali has done in Iraq, where she built up gender studies curricula together with Iraqi scholars and activists. So all in all, that was pretty long, but what I wanted to say, I think we just need more initiatives that critically evaluate what and how we teach. And I want to give it thereby to Elizabeth, and I look forward to discussing more with you.
Fantastic, truly wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Schmetting. Dr. Leek.
Great. Thank you so much, Annika. That was really fantastic. And actually, thanks to all three of you. This has been really, I think, really intellectually rejuvenating and such an important conversation to have. And actually think, so for kind of following off from Annika's points in particular, I'm going to try to keep my I guess, observations fairly brief. But I think especially kind of these last 2 points about kind of positionality and I guess practice, I think are two points that I've been particularly reflecting on. So I should say, so in terms of the question that Jay set when she very generously invited me and everyone to be involved in this roundtable, to reiterate, so what does decolonization of the study of Afghanistan mean to you and your scholarship? And how can we kind of successfully go about that? I should say, sort of in kind of thinking through some of those ideas, I really thought about scholarship in terms of practice, and I suppose in this respect, academic practice. So in that respect, thinking not only about, I suppose, research on Afghanistan, but also this question of teaching. And I'm going to try to talk about, I think, both of these different issues very briefly. I would say, it was really sort of, this question of positionality is one that I've certainly wrestled with quite a lot, I think, in terms of thinking about my own research. And I suppose where my interests lie, or kind of where I feel like I'm most equipped to sort of comment on issues, and I guess particularly around Afghanistan. And I guess personally speaking, I've more often tended to frame myself as a scholar of kind of global history or international history, rather than, I guess, being as deeply rooted in Afghan studies or studies of Afghanistan. I think partly because of my training. I guess my earlier research really focused on South Asian history, or as Cambridge called it in the UK, world history. And what was really noticeable, even for me, I guess, at an early stage too, is the fact that even in the kind of the milieu of South Asian studies, Afghanistan, I think particularly in history, Afghanistan still remains so underrepresented. And I think, you can look just at, I guess, like Annika was saying, I guess the big conferences that I go to, that are often kind of South Asian studies conferences, in Afghanistan very rarely appears, and there'll be maybe that one roundtable or maybe 2 or 3 papers, but but it's so rarely appears, even I think in South Asian studies, with which it is often sort of, I guess, associated or affiliated with. So I think that in and of itself has been something that's always been really striking to me, but also has meant then that I suppose that it's made me think really carefully then about the ways in which I kind of equipped to kind of speak to histories of Afghanistan. In my first book, I should say, I was predominantly focusing on histories of South Asia, colonial India, and Pakistan, and then I've moved much more into studying Afghanistan with the second book. So this has been very much a process. I should also say I do not have the language skills that Tim in particular has. So again, in terms of thinking about the ways that I approach the study, it is just slightly different. But I think one of the things, or kind of animating issues for me, is this question and this problem, I think, that Annika in particular really eloquently put about this question of making Afghanistan legible. And I think the fact that, the fundamental tragedy, I suppose, of the fact that we are having these conversations now about where Afghanistan fits in terms of scholarly work, in terms of learned societies, in terms of, I suppose, academia writ large. I think, the fact that I think it is a tragedy that we're having these conversations now, rather than thinking about the why have we not been able to have these conversations in a much sort of longer term sense, right? And so that sort of presentist nature, I think, is really important. And I think, in that sense, this roundtable and many of the other very public, the public events going on that are focusing on Afghanistan and Afghans, I think really needs to serve as a clarion call, though, to the field for thinking about how can we establish this as a field of study that is taken seriously, that takes itself seriously, and that is engaging with these different bodies, but also thinking, I think, taking the initiative as well in terms of framing itself in terms of whether South Asian studies, Middle Eastern studies, I guess US foreign relations, Soviet foreign relations, etc. So as I said, so my research has really looked kind of at South Asian and world history. My book that's coming out in April is a new history of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And it looks at a lot of the different actors who became involved in the civil war of the 1980s. So certainly different Afghan interest groups, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, some of the Islamist groups that Tim has already mentioned, but also then I guess international actors as well, whether the United States and Soviet Union, regional players like Pakistan, India, Iran, or China, or international institutions as well, such as the United Nations and the UN High Commission for Refugees. And I think something that I've really tried to think about and work through in my book is thinking firstly about Afghanistan as being an important site for international politics. I think Tim has really articulated that clearly already, but also likewise thinking about Afghans equally as being equally important as actors within the international sphere. And again, so I don't want to kind of get into that in sort of any depth, since Tim's already, I think, really covered that really well. But I think this sort of sense of the ways that Afghanistan has had this fundamentally global history is really important. And obviously, you know, something like Robert Cruise's book, Afghan Modern, has really demonstrated that point so eloquently. And this is something that I've been trying to think about, kind of think through in my own work, though focusing really on events of the 1980s. But I guess there were kind of 2 points with my research then that I thought I would bring up. I guess in terms of thinking about Afghanistan and kind of Afghanistan studies. I think the first one is just thinking about what are the histories that I guess I as a historian or kind of scholars more broadly, what are the histories that we replicate and what histories do we try to disrupt then in telling or kind of writing histories of Afghanistan. And this was something that I thought about with my book, really, I should say largely in thanks to Bob Cruise and kind of some kind of discussions with him. So kind of thinking about my book, this book on the 1980s. In the first iteration, I have this background chapter where I provide this sort of longer historical context to sort of set up some of the sort of intellectual and political and social developments that are really key or crucial before the April 1978 coup that brings the Afghan socialists to power. And in the first iteration, I had, I guess, what I would call kind of a really traditional narrative, starting with the British colonial encounter, talking about the ways that the notion of the tribe as a socio-political unit becomes really central, et cetera, and kind of really kind of replicating some of those narratives about kind of the ways in which British imperial encounters has shaped Afghanistan. And Bob instead kind of created this provocation, and instead he said, what happens and what sort of different histories do we tell if you instead start your history in 1905 with some of the earliest Afghan reform movements, with some of the kind of these secret organizations in which young Afghans really started mobilizing to debate what Afghanistan's political and social future could look like in terms that we would all recognize very much in kind of these modernist socio-political aspirations and kind of debates about what is an Afghan state, what is an Afghan nation, what is the language that we should use for thinking about Afghanistan's future. And I was really taken with this idea, and I followed through on that extremely, I think, really interesting and helpful suggestion in this book. So I started in 1905 rather than with Mount Stuart Elphinstone and his, the account of the Kingdom of Kabul. And I think kind of providing this sort of different lens was really helpful for me in terms of thinking about trying to disrupt some of these longer term histories or kind of reaffirming, but I think in this case, what would have been unintentionally, this kind of, again, this focus on Afghanistan as being tribal, as being just kind of a site of colonial intervention. And I think more along the lines of what Tim has been saying about some of the different ideas and debates emanating from Afghanistan that are not necessarily constrained to those sorts of categories. So I think that's one of the questions I think we need to think about. So, in terms of what sorts of histories we write, and I can't speak as much to some of the social sciences, but what should we replicate and what should we try to disrupt? And kind of how does the sort of context we give in the specific historical context serve to kind of continue specific narratives, but how can we also, I guess, even in kind of more surreptitious ways disrupt that? So that kind of takes me to the second point I wanted to bring up around research, which is this question about the relationship between histories and writing histories and then thinking about the present. I think there's a real tension in some ways for thinking about what is the historian's responsibility for thinking about the present. I think unsurprisingly, Tim, I'm guessing, gets probably the same thing. I get a lot of questions about kind of what I think should happen next in Afghanistan. And I often say I study the past, and my scholarship is very much rooted in the past. So I don't necessarily feel like I'm always, or not always, basically just about ever the best person to kind of make predictions about the future. But I think this also leads to sort of another question, which is what is our, I think there are responsibilities that we have as historians in terms of thinking about, how can we, by looking at the past, inform or kind of help to kind of extend understanding of the present and kind of, I guess, the fundamental messiness of some of the many dynamics and kind of events taking place within Afghanistan at the moment. But I also then think, though, that historians have a responsibility to not always be presentist. So for my book on the 1980s, I think it wasn't necessarily intentional, but it's been really important to me that I entered this project because I was interested in the time period itself, and actually how this project sort of fit on kind of off the back of my first book, which looked at the 1930s to the 1960s. So sort of kind of a continuation of that study of the past, rather than I guess, taking as its provocation, well, how does a study of the 1980s allow us to understand developments in Afghanistan since 2001? And I think in that sense, whilst it's important to think about what our responsibilities are for, I suppose, informing present debates, I think it's also important perhaps not to be too presentist in terms of choosing the historical questions we're asking about Afghanistan. So I think, I think one of the things that we can do and that needs to be done is that, historians in particular need to be asking the same sorts of questions about Afghanistan as they've done for other colonial and post-colonial states, right? So I guess, a very basic comparison, there's so many books about the Vietnam War, right? Why is it the case that there isn't the same sort of corpus of books about Afghanistan, that there are about the Vietnam War? Or, why aren't there dozens and, hundreds of articles and books, I don't know, about, different forms of Afghan anti-colonialism as there are for India, for example. So I think in that sense, it's important for scholars to be asking the same questions about Afghanistan as they have done for these other colonies, other post-colonial states. And in that sense too, and I think, and using that work then to think about and kind of appreciate and kind of, I guess, really confront the diversity and complexity of the past, as well as the present, rather than just, I think in particular, kind of moving away from this sort of geopolitical lens, as Tim mentioned. So those are kind of, I think, two sort of factors I think we need to bring in for, I guess, in terms of research, or kind of two sorts of questions around research that have been really animating me. I want to just turn briefly then as well to the question of teaching, because I actually think that's also one of the really key areas in which there are opportunities, I guess, for decolonizing the study of Afghanistan, which is just, I guess, at the most basic level, making sure that students understand Afghanistan's history and in not in potted ways. So I think I feel extremely privileged in the fact that I'm able to teach a year-long a senior seminar, what the UK calls a special subject, on histories of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And it's a class, so to all my final year undergraduates, they all write sort of research dissertations and theses alongside it. But it is a course that looks at the history of Afghanistan and Pakistan kind of in local, national, regional, and global context from the beginning of the 19th century up through the present day. And this is a course that I've now taught for 4 or 5 years. And I have to say, every year I'm changing the syllabus, but I think it's been a real provocation for me to think not only about how I can use this module to sort of disrupt understanding or to complicate the ways that, I guess, in this case, British students in their early 20s think about Afghanistan, and how, by changing the way that they perceive this region, how that can perhaps have these sort of broader ramifications then, and hopefully, I guess, reverberate out in terms of kind of disrupting, disrupting the ways that young people are reading the news, for example, and so that they can think then about what is the media representing and what are they not. But one of the things I've really thought about every year, and some of the tweaks I keep making, is thinking about certainly who are the authors I'm teaching, what are the themes that I'm teaching, and what sort of primary sources can I make available to students. So certainly I think, kind of speaking to some of Tim's points, we read a lot of poetry, we look at a lot of material culture. Thanks actually to Mejgan Masumi's work, I'm really trying to find a version of the Bollywood hit Dharmatma, which is a Bollywood movie that was filmed in Kabul in the 1970s, and it just looks amazing. But it, really kind of not only is really indicative of Afghan cosmopolitanism, but also Afghanistan is kind of being a central node in film and in creative endeavors as well. So really, this teaching for me is multifold in its purposes. It's certainly about kind of disrupting. It's about kind of disrupting some kind of tropes and stereotypes. It is also, though, of course, about teaching students about where is it that some of these ideas come from. The significance of colonial knowledge and knowledge production, and the ways that it has these long-term really pervasive influences, but also then to trying to introduce them to Afghan culture, Afghan politics, and Afghan voices in different ways as well. And I would say, Wasma, Anika, and Tim have all mentioned, a number of scholars, many of whom I teach, and I'm always looking for more. So I think I have to say that for me, I think in particular teaching, and particularly teaching undergraduates, is a really important aspect for me in terms of trying to decolonize the study of Afghanistan. I think the fact that Afghanistan, in most histories of South Asia that I've taught or been involved in, Afghanistan is almost never mentioned, and it shouldn't be that way. This whole relates to kind of think some broader questions about, I guess, the very Indo-centric nature actually of South Asian studies, which is a different debate than that what we're having today. But I think the point still stands about thinking about the ways that, if I as an educator can integrate the study of Afghanistan into more of the teaching that I do, and then use that as well, I think, to kind of disrupt, I think, particularly young people's assumptions then about what Afghanistan's place has been in the world and the place that it should have in the world. So I'll end with that, but I'm more than happy, I think, to talk more about my teaching, more about my research. The final thing I'll say is, of course, I think one of the things I know is, like, with my teaching is that there's always room for improvement. And I know that there are areas where I still need to sort of keep expanding my purview. My teaching, for example, still tends to be very kind of focused, I think, on ethnic Pashtuns in particular. I'm trying to diversify that. So I totally agree with Annika and take the point about kind of ethnicity is not the only sort of lens. But I think, just to say that I think in that sense, kind of this evolutionary process, or kind of coming back and tweaking my reading lists and kind of my key themes from year to year, is a really fruitful exercise, and for me as a researcher as well as an educator.
Fantastic. A huge round of applause for all our speakers. Just, oops, I raised my hand accidentally. Great. So we are now open to questions. I'm going to lower my hand. So please raise your hands and I'll call on you, and you can ask questions to our four speakers. Thank you, truly. This is so much food for thought. And the last point about Elizabeth's point about teaching, I've actually made this roundtable an extra credit for my undergrads. So you might actually get a lot of questions from some of the undergraduate students here. Great. So from the audience, I do know some of my students have questions. Gracie, for example. Gracie, go ahead.
Hi, thank you all for being with us today. My first question is actually about the teaching aspect of the history of Afghanistan. So prior to college, I basically had no educational background on any of the history of Afghanistan besides brief readings in high school, but most of those were focused on more of like the American history of being in Afghanistan, and like almost more of like a patriotic, like, oh, America's winning in Afghanistan type of approach from my previous history teachers. So I was curious about like what recommendations or what maybe the most important changes are to the history of Afghanistan being taught at like a younger level, and then as well as at like a college level.
Whoever from the roundtable wants to take the question, or perhaps we can go around. All four of you might have some thoughts. I'll let you decide that.
I can just briefly start and then maybe connect it to some of the themes that the co-panelists brought up too, which is I think although yes, Afghanistan has been underrepresented in many disciplines and conferences, but I see a real emergence of really interesting new developments happening, as some of my co-panelists have mentioned. So there's new voices coming in, and I think there's many more interesting and well-researched books and articles and things to add. And I'll point to some of the people that are on this panel, without naming everybody. You can see who's on here, some of the newer faces, as opposed to what I would say the earlier canon, which was in many ways more of a colonial reiteration of the dynamics in Afghanistan. And I'll also point out, people like, as we've mentioned, Mishgan Musami, Annika Schmedding herself, has done in-depth research and is fluent in the local languages. So I think those are the types of things we want to look at is something before I was in academia, I was a journalist, and we called parachuting, where people become these overnight experts and go for a week or two and then produce books, that are essentially reiteration of other works without much new analysis or questioning the paradigms of knowledge production. And so there's a number of new works to be had. And I'll add to that another point that I wanted to make in regards to some of the questions that my co-panelists raised, which is the concept of positionality, right? How do we position ourselves vis-a-vis knowledge production, as well as acknowledging privilege, right? And once again, I'll go back to my journalistic roots, where I was working at one institution, and we were told that for segments where we were interviewing, this was a New York-based media institution, that for segments for experts, we wanted to have, oftentimes they would say, get white experts, white people in academia and so forth. And then for the on-the-ground witness accounts, the more embodied source of information, then you go to people of color, you go to marginalized communities, where it's supposed to be the data then that forms support to the white experts that were brought in. And I thought, okay, so this is a problem in the realm of journalism, but it's very much so, as Annika pointed out, a problem in academia, including in Afghanistan studies and history and anthropology and so forth. But in anthropology, we also have had a moment of reckoning where we very much incorporate our positionality. So if you're, writing a book, you have to explain the details of what your relationship is to the subject that you're studying. And the same types of problematic situations happen where somebody like me, who I consider myself Afghan American, even though I have all my credentials and doctorate work and so forth, oftentimes we are categorized as being more biased. And same thing with Afghan scholars, like, oh, if you have affiliations with this ethnic group or this religious group, you're going to be more biased in your work. And that's just not the case. We have to also go back to looking at why is it that the dominant group the group that has dominated Afghanistan studies has been Anglo-European American white scholars, and there isn't that same type of positionality discussed in their work, and there needs to be. And the reason why there isn't is because there's a taken for granted understanding that they are the voice of authority and that they're entirely impartial and come from a zoomed out analytical perspective where they can analyze in a way that we cannot. And I think that's a huge problem, and that we need to, as once again Annika mentioned, elaborate those and raise those issues in these kinds of dialogues, as well as in the work that we write, and also acknowledge, more marginalized scholars who have these embedded biases placed against us automatically, that, we are not taken as the voice of authority in the same capacity. So I'll leave it there.
Does anybody else on the roundtable want to respond or add anything to what Wajma had said? It's very comprehensive response, Wajma. Thank you.
I'll just check in just really quickly. I would honestly, just to echo one thing that Wajma said, I think actually we are, in a really exciting moment, I suppose, in some respects in studying Afghanistan, because I think there has been as you said, there's been so much really great work that has come out, I would say particularly in like the last 10 to 15 years or so, that has, I think, really complicated these narratives. I mean, I've got 2 of Niall Green's edited volumes sitting behind me, and kind of the edited volumes are fantastic too, because they bring in so many different perspectives. And I think also maybe one of the things that, like, I don't know, it's like, this is maybe just throwing it out there, but it's like, I think one of the things that's really exciting is how interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary a lot of these volumes or a lot of these studies are. So, and I think there's a lot has been brought to the table by kind of, I think, the ways that scholars are drawing on not just history, but anthropology or sociology, and bringing in different methods as well. And I think in that respect, it is really exciting to me, kind of, every time something there is, that so much new stuff is being published. And I think every single time it is, I mean, I totally agree with Mohammed that there is a lot of this sort of parachuting in. I think we saw that a lot in August in particular. But I think in terms of some of the scholarship that's emerging, and that, it is so rich and it is really exciting. So I think in that sense too, I think it has changed really drastically. I mean, even since I started working in the field.
If I can just jump in and make a very quick addition, I think one of the benefits of the kind of press and publishing environment that Wajma published on and researched on in her book was that it created a really welcome and open space for a lot of publishing interventions, including memoirs from former foreign ministers, many other historic political actors. Just to maybe answer the question directly, a lot of the works that I've learned a lot from are books by both diaspora, former Shia Islamists living in Finland, this guy, Mohammad Reza Alavi, and this other guy, Misbah Zodeh, who is the son of a Shia activist who was killed by the PDPA in the late 1970s. And, I think one of the problems that we have here is, like, there is a ton, and there's a ton of really important and interesting books published in the Afghan publishing scene from 2001 to 2021. And yet I think this gets back to Annika's point about sort of, are you a theory maker or are you a source? And reading these books, in particular, this book by Alavi on these so-called left Islamist thinkers, he raises really interesting questions of, like, what did Islamism mean by the late 1980s? Was the late Najibullah regime in particular socialist in any meaningful sense? Kind of what did these actors do with themselves as the Cold War really comes to an end in that part of the world? But here I think we have kind of the usual structural problems of translation and what sort of field conversations are we speaking to? You can be the most eloquent scholar in the world, but if you're presenting at maybe Mesa, you're decentered in a way. If you're presenting at Schaefer, you're perhaps decentered in another way. So I think that's the challenge we face going ahead, is both engaging with these works, perhaps translating them, and then highlighting how these Afghan voices and experiences are really relevant to the way that we think about the history of socialism or Islamism or other thinkers. A lot of these guys talk a lot about how important Ali Shariati, the Iranian intellectual, was in Afghanistan. There are dozens of books out now on Shariati and decolonization. I don't know of any books in English or even Persian, for that matter, on specifically Shariati in Afghanistan, even though it was really important in the 60s and 70s. So I think there's a lot of room out there, but it raises these questions of translation, language, and institutions.
Absolutely. Annika, do you want to add something? We do have questions, so if you want to add something.
Yeah, I can just add just a couple of small things. And I think my co-panelists actually already answered these questions really good. But I think one of the things that I've been seeing, and of course things have right now changed, and we need to see how things will shake out in terms of research within the country as well after August. But in the last kind of 10 years, what I've actually seen is there were quite a lot of new people, also a lot of anthropologists who were coming and doing research in Afghanistan. And that's not only the white European or American, but also like people from the region, from Iran, from East South Asia as well, like from different places who were researching and did a lot of more in-depth ethnographic research as well. And at the time when I did my PhD research in Afghanistan, we had a small group of people who were like meeting with each other to discuss challenges and questions and how, you know, to portray things as well, and how to write about it and how to conduct the ethnographic research. And I think like in those years, what was interesting to me was that the research was very much possible in Afghanistan as well. And I think people a lot of times didn't really think about it in that way, because of course it was an insurance problem to even go to Afghanistan for most universities. So of course the thing looks right now very different to that, but there is, I think, a lot of people who have really interesting material and who also will be publishing in the near future, who have been working on these materials for the past 5 to 10 years. And one of the questions I just see in the chat about how we can spread the idea of decolonizing history. I mean, I can't talk so much about history because I'm more an anthropologist who works on present day Afghanistan, though I do use a lot of oral history of the last 50, 60 years, actually, of different communities and how they position themselves. And the question was, how can it be made palatable to people who mainly consume from Western mass media and or are not academics on the subject? And I really think that it's also a question of approaching it from all of those different directions of actually like talking about poetry, talking about music, talking about how they intertwine both with the history, the politics of the country, the ways how people perceive the world, and also just showing that in many different ways. You know, I mean, I think it's an important part of us to figure out how can we actually make other people see why we are so fascinated by this country and this place and these people and this culture and the myriad of cultures that actually coexist and intermingle in this place. And I think that we just need to actually bring some of that ethnographic embedding, that taste of that into some of the ways we even talk about Afghanistan, not as a policy point, not just as a place where, you know, foreign intervention happens, but actually as a place where people live and where people think about that foreign intervention, how they're positioned with towards that. So I think making that come alive also is a part of rewriting that history, of rethinking how we talk about the place and the people there. So yeah, but I see there are more questions.
Great. Thank you so much. Perhaps we can turn to Sean for his question. Sean Case.
I just want to thank all of the panelists. This has been a fantastic roundtable. And I think what I have enjoyed the most is in your discussion of decolonizing the study of Afghanistan, you haven't situated and centralized the war. Like you focused so much on the people. And so I have deeply appreciated that. And so speaking to Dr. Noonan's point about the impending humanitarian crisis, and what I found is that it crosscuts, whether historical or anthropological, is the idea of diaspora, the kind of, I think as Dr. Schmedling pointed out, the idea of the passport, how that has created a certain degree of hierarchy, but even more so, how it seems as if the existing narratives that are developing have to do with tragedy in terms of characterizing the US withdrawal, the humanitarian crisis, the move to get interpreters out of Afghanistan. Yeah, how that falls into kind of the politics of the tragic. And so my question to you all is how to avoid that and how to separate it while maintaining the actual lived struggles that people are enduring, both within and outside of the country.
I can maybe try to take a crack at that, unless we want to group questions. But thanks for your question, Sean. And yeah, I think one way to think about this is, you know, on the one hand, I think in a small way, panels like this, I think, you know, the kind of writing we do, you know, activism we do, solidarity that Annika mentioned are really important tools for and ways of addressing the current crisis. But in terms of kind of mental models and how you encourage audiences to think about this differently, and maybe this connects to L. Nicoletti's question in the chat. I think that one potential option might be thinking of Afghanistan not only as this place of sort of horrible tragedy and permanent crisis, but in a way, perhaps as sort of a preview or a microcosm of problems of global governance that I think we're likely to see in settings beyond Afghanistan in the future. I think you're the so-called term of a poly crisis, and just to make this more concrete, I think there's ways of writing this into history. If you look at, for instance, the 1973 coup d'état against Mohammed Daoud Khan. This was preceded, and many scholars argue precipitated by a major drought in the country that led to increases in food prices. It led to dissatisfaction with the ruling family. We can take this further back and think about the impact of deforestation in eastern Afghanistan, in part through illegal logging and shipping to markets in Pakistan. There's a bigger background to this, of course, with the geopolitical shocks of 1971, the India-Pakistan dynamic, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the basic point is, insofar as we're likely to be facing future problems of like deforestation, climate change, diseases that jump from animals to humans, and so on. I think it's important not to just portray Afghanistan as this sort of this horrible place where these sort of crises keep on happening. But I think that using perhaps lenses of environment, food security in the history and in the past as ways of showing how Afghanistan is not just this sort of backward, hopeless place, but has been, for various reasons, exposed to these shocks that I think we're likely to see more and more in sort of so-called safe locations. That might be one way of doing it, but I'm also eager to hear what my colleagues have to say.
I think one of the problems that I'm actually grappling with in some of that is, how do we actually show both of these things? I mean, it's not untrue that Afghans really, are situated in a terrible situation for so many different reasons, and I think just ignoring that, I mean, we don't have to talk about it as a kind of narrative of tragedy, but I think, how do we kind of hold that both actually, and actually also do it justice in ways that we write about it. And one of the ways, for example, in some of my writing, when COVID hit, for example, I teamed up with an Afghan colleague of mine, Omar Sharifi, and we wrote about both kind of how Afghans actually sprung up and used solidarity networks to help economically other Afghan families during this crisis, but also to at the same time talk about how much the healthcare system, for example, was dependent on healthcare tourism to India, and how Afghans suddenly were cut off from that and weren't able to go anywhere. And I think it's kind of of course, the situation was pretty dire, or still is. And I guess we're also not talking about COVID anymore because for Afghanistan, because of course it's there. It's just that so many other things are so more pressing, of people not actually having food, of people actually having so many other problems right now in this current situation. But I think one of the ways to talk about that or address that is to not erase the difficulties that Afghans face, but to look as well at the resources with which they're trying to face them, the ways that they're trying to deal with them. And I think actually Wajma really said it really beautifully well when she said that Afghans have been so much negotiators, diplomats, and hagglers. And I find that a lot as well in my work. When I was writing about how different Sufi communities, for example, had to deal with different ideological governments, with migration, with wartime, and how they dealt with that in very ingenious ways. And this didn't mean that they were not affected by the violence. Many of these communities actually were killed, were put into prison, were definitely targeted. But they also found ways to survive and to keep their community intact. And I think it's kind of a challenge to tell both of these stories and not to erase the agency of Afghans specifically, but also not to erase the violence that these people face, and the people who we research on and who we work with.
Wadma and Elizabeth, do you have anything to add, or should we move to the next questions?
I mean, I think Tim and Annika said it well, but maybe I'll just reiterate the points made, which is that I think it is really important to hold the reality of both situations, right? And that we want to think about all the achievements made, but at the same time, the situation is very tragic, both right now and if we look at historically, the last 40 years have been really devastating and terrible in many respects. And so I've had a number of people who've read my book and comment on, reading your book is so painful and tragic to see these moments where you've had all these progress and you've had, developments in culture and media and poetry and incredible output in terms of television and film and so forth. And then it's another cycle of war and fighting and what we call brain drain. So people who have amassed those skill sets and talent leave, and another crisis. And currently between inflation and as people have pointed out, the winter coming, the situation is very dire. And so I think we have to hold the truth of that these interventions, both domestic actors, but also foreign interventions, as much as they've been helpful in certain ways, have created a cycle of devastation and tragedy in Afghanistan, and we cannot skirt away from that. But it is important to talk about, as Annika said, the beauty and culture and the reasons why people are excited to work there and talk about those positive developments as well.
Jay, I'm happy for you to maybe move on to the next question.
Okay, all right. So we have a question from Alyssa, followed by Christian. Alyssa, go ahead.
Yes.
It's slightly hard. Can you try again? Perhaps without the headphones.
Is it better? Okay. Professor Shmendi, you said that commenters have found importance in researching about tribes in Afghanistan. Do you think that with the reemergence of the Taliban and different tribes being involved on both sides of the war, there will be more talk about the tribes in academia as a whole, or do you believe that they'll be overlooked again?
I think that, what do I think about the emergence of the Taliban with tribes? Good question. I think I don't have a crystal ball to say where research is going and what people are gonna, what kind of frames of reference people are going to use in terms of research to try and understand the Taliban or rifts within the Taliban or different groups as well. I think for as much critique as anthropologists have leveled against questions of how ethnicity is constructed and how the idea of tribes is used in popular media, it's not that many people listen to us, to be honest. I mean, there is a lot of literature that deconstruct these particular terms and also problematizes them in the analysis that we're using. I'm not against using any of these terms. I'm just very much against using them uncritically and using them in terms that seems self-explanatory and descriptive, whereas what they actually should be kind of categories of inquiry, where we actually see what kind of work do these categories actually do, or what do they also sometimes preclude us from seeing. And I think that's very similarly with other categories when we're talking about Islam. What does it explain with the Taliban right now, and what does it not explain? How do actually put potentially other aspects of socialization, of gendered structures, of many other things, do explain other aspects as well of this particular group, or of fissures within this group. And so I think I'm actually curious to see how different people are going to start tackling the study of the current moment as well, because I don't think that it's an easy one. I also don't think that it's so directly clear, because as well, of course, like the Taliban as a government are not the most, even though of course you have now Twitter accounts and the Taliban being, you know, tweeting prolifically, but you do not really have a transparent government right now where we really fully understand what is happening inside. So I think the study of like the current moment is going to be an interesting one, but we should really try and push for a critical use of any of those categories.
Excellent. So this was a question for Anika. So I think we can move on to the next question, unless Tim, Elizabeth, Wajma, you would like to add anything to what Anika said. Okay. All right. We have our next question from Christian, followed by Rohala. Christian, go ahead.
Hi. First of all, thank you for speaking today. It's been really interesting. I actually first became interested in this topic in Professor Case's class last year, and so it's good to see you again. But I was going to ask a question to Dr. Osman or anybody. You mentioned falsified or unreliable data in the region. Either on the side of the United States government that wants to show, you know, maybe a less than accurate version of events, or just in an unstable region, it's hard to have reliable data. How in the scholarly community, how do you combat that? How do you vet data from these regions?
That's a great question, Christian, and something that, you know, I look at in my work too, because even though I'm an anthropologist, we have to rely on data sets, and we have to rely on, you know, historical data and archives and so forth. And one of the ways I try to combat it is, for example, in addition to the statistics I just talked about in terms of exaggerations around women's education, and so forth. I was looking at, for example, I would interview different TV stations, and they would say, well, we have the most audience share. And then they would produce, you know, they would give me data that was sponsored by, you know, either the US Embassy in Kabul or USAID or the British Embassy and some of the other supporters of those particular stations that pretty much reiterated that the stations that those foreign governments were allocating monies towards did have the most market share. And when I was interviewing people, there was discrepancy, and that's where I realized, I was like, oh, you know, this study that was sponsored by this state government says that across the board, this is the most popular station amongst these groups, and these are the programs that people watch the most. But when I was talking to people and interviewing people, which is what, you know, ethnographic anthropological work is really good at, is speaking to people. And I conducted over 100 interviews. People would talk about all these other programs that they actually enjoyed and other TV stations and so forth. And that's when I realized that there is this problem with it. And so one of the ways I try to counter that is by relying also, so I would still incorporate those studies, but I would contextualize it within what we call the political economy, or where the funding comes from. And then at the same time, use excerpts from my interviews to say, actually, these other stations and these other media outlets and these other TV programs are also really popular for these reasons, beyond just that. Yeah, but I think to your question, Christian, as scholars, we always have to be wary. And, you know, same thing as audiences and viewers, when we hear, oh, this is this way or just that way, when we have these kinds of graphs and charts and statistics.
Absolutely. No, thank you very much, Wajma. Let's hear from Rohala about his question.
Hello, and thank you very much for the excellent panel. Actually, when Gieta, you announced that the next series of the talks would be in March, I felt, you know, that's a long time to wait. So I want more of these events. I really enjoyed all panelists' input, and particularly I enjoyed that a lot of the things that I was actually kind of thinking about, maybe the kind of vacuums that was always visible but not as articulated, were actually very well articulated here. Particularly the very important input that Timothy mentioned about the importance of poetry. So Afghanistan is probably by some account is considered an oral culture. A lot of the material is verbal, is not textual. So, and a lot of it is also in the language of, let's say, poetry, but also music, and Dubaiti and Charbaiti and Rubai. So a lot of the women's narratives you can find in woman Charbaitis, let's say. So scholars must be open to all kinds of data, but also Dr. Schmiding's input on putting self on the text. Because scholars are not just machines, because scholars are also part of the process of production of that data. So they're not just channels that turn data into, let's say, theories. But my question is just open to all panelists about locating Afghanistan. Because a lot of the universities around the world, they locate the study of Afghanistan, what they call the study of Afghanistan, in different departments, different disciplines, as Dr. Schmiding mentioned. So is it considered a Central Asian country, South Asian country, Middle Eastern country, based on categorization, based on religion, based on ethnic representations, and everything else? So not only locating Afghanistan studies from a university perspective in the West particularly, but also locating Afghanistan, because that confusion is not only felt among the scholars, but also among the citizens of Afghanistan as well, because it's pulled in all directions. So that is one thing that I would like to hear from the panelists, what they think about that, but also about the possibility of how more voices of, let's say, Afghans can come out and can be heard. The thing is that maybe my apologies if I'm going a little longer, is that a lot of times Afghanistan is a very, of course, divided society. And among those divisions, scholars are also human beings. It's not always, I would say, impossible for scholars to fall into those traps. And actually, there are examples that one can talk about. But the example of what kind of categories, what kind of terms are developed, like earlier, the question of tribe was mentioned. So Afghanistan in general, a lot of scholars are referring to all sorts of groups in terms of tribes, but all social categories are not ascribing to the concept of tribe. So not all social groups are tribal. So Hazaras, for example, are never attributing to themselves as a tribe. Uzbeks the same, because tribe has a different structure and roots. But on the other hand, the word ethnicity, there is no Farsi or Pashto translation of the word ethnicity. So at least I haven't come across of a good translation or equal term. So how these negotiations that not only are translation problems, but also a lot of academic issues can raise, like the uniquely talking about Afghanistan as a tribal society, when a huge majority of its people do not ascribe to that kind of term, introducing their representation of their group. Let's say a lot of these groups are religious. Some of them are based on a lot of other attribution that is not necessarily tribe. It was a little bit a mishmash of all sorts of questions and comments, but I will appreciate any views that panelists can share.
Truly excellent. I think that's an excellent last question to wrap up our roundtable on decolonizing the study of Afghanistan with. So we can go in the order that we started, or it could be entirely open-ended. So if each one of you could respond to Rohala's excellent 2 questions, and really important, it's going to give us a lot of food for thought, because this video, as you know, will be uploaded on YouTube. The conversations will go on in our heads and in our various kinds of collaborations that we and other people will take. So if each of you could respond, that would be great, and we can conclude after that.
I mean, maybe I'll just start us off to say on Rohala John's last point about tribe and ethnicity is, you know, something we all look at in our work. But I think, as some of the co-panelists and Rohala John himself mentioned, is that there has been an overemphasis on tribal politics in the scholarship. And as Anika and other people mentioned, now scholars are trying to complicate that and look at issues of class and rural and urban divide and many other vectors and factors that come into play that you know, are just as salient and just as important to look at. And that's not to say that tribe is not one of the ways that social life is viewed through. It is one of the aspects of society. And, you know, if we look at it historically, there has been a dominance by Pashtun tribes in governance and so forth. But at the same time, that does not negate the incredible achievements and contributions of people from all the other tribes, right? From Tajiks and Uzbeks and Hazaras and many other people from both within the government and outside of the government who've managed to do really great things. And this is in the pre-war times that I'm talking about. In the post-war time, I would say there was even more actors and more diversity in terms of people who were contributing to society. Of course, ultimately issues of corruption and other policy failures implemented and you know, militarism and so forth led to the Taliban takeover. But yeah, I'll start us off by saying that much.
Thanks for your questions, Rohula, and good to see you if in this format. I'll offer maybe 2 quick thoughts. I think that your point about the lack of certain terminology in either Dari or Pashto is really a good jumping off point. And I think one potential future agenda item for the field might be doing these conceptual histories of kind of how to do violence to people with imported concepts. Oftentimes, I think one area of study that James Karen has worked on in this direction, but I think there's a lot of room for exploration, is how European notions of race, of whiteness, of a so-called Aryan race, et cetera, were translated and kind of imported and even embedded in things like textbooks or school curricula by modernizing elites in Afghanistan in the 1930s and 1940s. In particular, this is one area where I have a lot of questions, and maybe I'm just ignorant on recent literature, but I would like to know more about how these concepts of race and ethnicity may have been appropriated by Afghan nationalists during that period. But I think back to the question from Ella Nicoletti and kind of making things legible, and to some of Elizabeth's impulses on writing the history of the war. I have heard, I think I believe that in interviews that Jennifer Murtazashvili to Pittsburgh has given, she has suggested that one potential reason for the American fixation on ethnicity rather than class, as Anika said, as the kind of key figure through which to understand Afghanistan may be an inheritance from the Bosnian Wars. This idea of, if you're going to do nation building and if you're going to solve these crises, the key factor is going to be kind of ethnic conflict and ethnicity. I'm not sure, right? I don't know if that's kind of empirically true or if we've done sort of enough research on that, but I think the key thing here is to see how these concepts of ethnicity, race, and kind of ethnic division are perhaps not endemic to Afghanistan, but have been sort of imported conceptually through these patterns, whether Afghan elites or the international community in the early 2000s. I think those are crucial to investigate. And yeah, I think in terms of kind of integrating more Afghan scholars into the conversation, I think particularly historians need to bone up on being better in terms of analyzing precisely the formats of orality that you described. I'm not sure how we get that conversation started, especially in the fields or subfields that I inhabit, but I think that is incredibly important. In my own case, it was only after seeing Ismail Balkhi's sort of portrait on sort of magazine after magazine after magazine that I started to realize, like, oh, this guy is actually pretty important, and yet somehow I haven't really read about him much in histories of 20th century Afghanistan. You know, why is that? And so yeah, I think a kind of celebration and centering of formats beyond just text, as Annika suggested earlier.
Yeah, so good to see you, Ruhollah Jan, as well on this format. And thank you for the question. I think, well, there's multiple things, of course. I think trying to get at these other perspective and these other views also on orality and like collecting that. Of course, a lot of times it seems more that it's anthropologists who are doing that in the field who are collecting it, but of course, like it's historians as well who work with Afghans in diaspora or in Afghanistan as well, with private collections, with people's own recollection from a particular time. I mean, of course, that depends on which time frame that historian also works on, whether that can be an additional source to look at some of these things that you want to investigate. But I think one of the, and I think what kind of like Tim brought up is an interesting aspect, of course, as well of knowledge production in Afghanistan, which is how is it embedded, even for like anthropologists as well in the last like 20 years, where a lot of like young social scientists, for example, found more employment within the NGO scene than actual like, academic institutions that would pay them to do research. So a lot of it was contract research. And of course, a lot of people who came kind of like as humanitarians to work in Afghanistan had also, a pre-knowledge of other humanitarian disasters, other places, and it of course brought with them as well particular categories and ways of seeing place, because they a lot of times did not come from the academic study of Afghanistan. So I think there's these, interrelationships of that as well. And I think, I mean, particularly in anthropology, but also kind of like in human geography, there's some actually really poignant writing, of course, about the aid sector, the humanitarian intervention and its knowledge production as well in Afghanistan. So we do have some critical knowledge that has come out from that. But I think it's always important to kind of question how is knowledge positioned and produced and who produces it, and how can we actually support a diversity of voices that questions as well which concepts have been imported and which concepts are actually really salient in the particular context that we look at, in which ways are they motivated and used.
Brilliant. I mean, I don't think I have too much more to add. I mean, I agree. I mean, I think this question of language and terminology is one that I've definitely been wrestling with, and it's something that's really interesting to me. I think particularly, I was looking for a different project. I was looking at Afghanistan's various constitutions of the 20th century, and those are really interesting for seeing what is the terminology used in particular. And I think around these questions of nationhood, or tribe or ethnicity, but actually seeing the absence of those terms actually in many of most of the constitutions of the 20th century. And I think those sorts of documents are so fascinating for thinking about what are the terms used, kind of what do those demonstrate in terms of various forms of self-fashioning. The thing that's really frustrating with, not frustrating per se, this question, because particularly, I guess, where do we situate Afghanistan, or kind of these possibilities of more Afghan voices? I don't know. It just feels to me slightly like there's there's a need and a requirement, and I think obviously it's something that we're all cognizant of, but I think this need to kind of just fundamentally embrace the complexity and the messiness of Afghan history, just like the way we embrace and recognize the complexity and messiness of American history or British history or Indian or Pakistan, you know, the histories of all other kind of states, and this kind of, and in terms that are not sort of framed around the exceptional, but kind of recognizing this multiplicity of histories. And I guess that's probably one of the areas in which I guess we see, I suppose, kind of Afghanistan's perhaps sort of siloing off, whether in terms of South Asian studies or Middle Eastern studies, et cetera, really coming into play in terms of kind of which of those sorts of aspects come to the fore. But I mean, I think there is this real question about kind of the institutions that I think that Annika brought up. And I mean, it's something that I wrestle with, I think, particularly in terms of talking to potential prospective PhD students as well, is, you know, there isn't necessarily the institutional support either for, you know, for funding, for, you know, I mean, pandemic and environment aside, you know, for being able to go and do this sort of research. I guess, you know, for perhaps, you know, being able to learn additional languages to do this research as well. So, I mean, I think there's some real structural issues at hand that we have to wrestle with as well. I mean, in terms of what sort of, you know, what sort of funding and, you know, even barring the issues of visas, et cetera, are available to kind of help create, I guess, further generations of scholarship. And this, you know, and I think Annika's point too about kind of about who, you know, where many scholars or anthropologists are going really speaks to this, right? It's like, when was the last time someone who really, you know, who does Afghan history got hired into a South Asia job in the US or the UK, or it's a, you know, I got hired to do US foreign policy and snuck through the door. So, you know, I think this is a real question, and this is one of those areas in which I guess area studies does matter in really problematic ways because of the ways it is sort of limiting those sorts of opportunities. But, you know, and I don't have an answer there, but I think thinking about what are the opportunities that, I guess, within our own institutions or using learned societies or other kind of groups, what are the opportunities for creating opportunities, and also for recognizing the sorts of skills in particular that need to be developed for these sorts of projects to really get off the ground. And likewise, kind of what sort of partnerships as well. Historians, I feel like, are exceptionally bad as well in terms of kind of partnering with non-historians or kind of local organizations. TIM is definitely an exception to that rule. But I think, you know, in that sense, I think historians in particular could be better in terms of working with local interlocutors in a much more valuable and textured way.
Truly fantastic. We have reached the end of our time, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all our 4 panelists for extremely insightful comments. And as I mentioned, this conversation doesn't end here, right? It goes on. And we're also trying to organize a second roundtable in March on the same issue with a different set of scholars, because it's an ongoing conversation. So thank you. Thank you really to Wajma, Annika, Elizabeth, Timothy. Thank you to the excellent questions. Yeah, this has been great. It's a true honor to host you all. Thank you once again.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, thanks so much for organizing, Jay.
Yes, thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.